the whole thesis is like change from within is Denizen's tagline, right? So the provocation, the awakening is about the holistic responsibility for systems change. And I think once you come into the ecosystem, doing the work holistically, but also doing the work strategically across the actors. And so I'm excited about, the movement around systems change that we're all a part of, because as crazy as it sounds, like it has to happen. It's daunting to even talk about it happening. And the way that I think it happens is that we all take responsibility for it and all see it that way.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance, exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today's guest is Jenny Stefanotti. She is the founder and steward of Denizen. Welcome, Jenny.
Thanks for having me.
So how would you summarize Denizen?
I think it's both a platform for content and community.
Mm-hmm.
And the content is exploring systemic change with two critical questions. Can we envision a future that is fundamentally just, regenerative, and caring? And if we could, how would we get from here to there? And I think that secondary question is really critical.
Mm-hmm.
And then the conversation has been a magnet for incredible people at the forefront of the work. It started as a co-learning, in my living room platform to explore these sorts of questions. And so there's a really important community component around systems change leaders and thinkers and people who are passionate about this work to come together and actually do the work holistically together.
Yeah. I originally found out about your work from our mutual friend, Chelsea Robinson, who we've had on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember her leaving me a voice note saying, this was the most well-researched host I've ever experienced. She's totally on top of her game. And when I went to your website, I was just struck by how much breadth of content that you've been doing, how many different conversations. And as I mentioned to you as well, a little bit overwhelmed by the ambition to weave all of these different threads.
Yeah.
So can you maybe frame the 6 content pillars?
Yeah, of course. So beneath those, I like to lay out that overarching question.
Yeah.
And when I say fundamentally, I memean that it actually stably yields the outcomes we want for humanity. So Denizen's vision is humanity flourishing in harmony with life on Earth. So that that's analogous to Kate Raworth's donut, right? It's flourishing. So the bottom, it's actually a little bit more than just basic needs are met. We're flourishing,
Yep.
and we're we're not, extending beyond what the biosphere can handle. But the mission is to accelerate a global awakening. And I think that's where the kind of media piece fits in. And to galvanize collective action towards comprehensive systemic change. And so the 6 pillars, and so comprehensive systemic change is really the scope of what I call the Denizen inquiry with those 2 questions. And there's 6 pillars that we explore. It's economics, which is very much the center of gravity, because I feel like economic incentives, you can think about capitalism capturing culture. What do we value? We value living in big houses and driving fancy cars and a lot of consumption.
Mm-hmm.
It captures politics. That's obvious, right?
Mm-hmm.
In some ways it's really affected our consciousness, but maybe we'll get into a thread around that piece of it. And so the 6 pillars are economics, politics, culture, consciousness, justice, and technology. And so topic by topic, I'm trying to kind of stitch together all the pieces of the puzzle of that society that stably yields those outcomes. And the intention is to have listeners be able to come in and say, okay, UBI is a topic we should understand. And so I do a lot of heavy lifting in the research, but I want my audience to be able to come in and say, okay, let me listen to this hour and I get UBI at a pretty robust level. I mean, it's not for the intellectually faint of heart. When I talk about UBI, I talk about what are all the policy design considerations? What is the frequency? Who does it go to? Things like that. I get super robust. But then for people who want to go deeper, there's a summary of UBI, just a super quick and dirty outline of okay, here's all the things that you need to know written in addition to the podcast. Oh, and then here's the papers that I read. So if you want to go down the rabbit hole and read this really amazing political, if anybody's interested in UBI, it's an amazing paper. My listeners can kind of go deeper into, if you want to read the content moderation paper that was prepared for Congress, I read that. That's linked on the website. And so there's an ability to kind of go from succinct hour into going deeper down the rabbit hole. But a topic might many, many topics, I would argue actually most topics will map to multiple pillars.
Right.
But you can go and be like, okay, what are all the other things in culture?
Right.
So I'm exploring, how does culture affect political change? How does culture affect human behavior and incentives? What about the different vectors of culture? I see them as all interrelated. I don't think you can kind of parse out one versus the other.
Right.
And then with technology, it's really understanding, how does technology affect these institutional structures? So, how does social media affect the information ecology and affect democracy? Or how do these new technologies enable new opportunities for experimentation with new models like blockchain and cryptocurrencies? And so technology is like, I'm not interested in the latest technology, but I'm interested in technology as it's relevant for these kind of socioeconomic institutional reform questions that we're exploring.
Right. So for someone who's not familiar with you and your background and context, can you share more about, what are you bringing in terms of your lens into this work, and where are you placed?
Yeah. I mean, I think I have a pretty eclectic background that allows me to take a topic and do the research and very quickly come up to speed. So I think a huge thing that I'm providing for the audience is just the ability to synthesize something really complex and also integrate it across the other topics that we're covering. So my background, there's kind of three critical parts of my background that are actually four that are most relevant for the work that I do. The first one is, early in my career, I was a strategy consultant and then internal strategy, operator in the tech industry, most notably at Google between 2004 and 2008. So I started just after the IPO when we had like 2,500 employees just after the IPO. And then I left, we had 25,000. So this explosive moment in Google's growth. I helped build out the company internationally. I also met my husband there, who left and became a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. So there's this whole kind of chapter of my story that's about like deeply understanding Silicon Valley and technology and the thesis around tech's role in human progress, and how both big companies work, as well as the kind of innovation ecosystem of the startup from my role with my husband. But I left Google and got a master's in international development and economics. So that's kind of the second piece that's really relevant in how I do my work. And there I went from sort of micro strategy effectively to macro strategy and understanding, like a very robust degree in econ. It's actually like rigorous economics equivalent to an econ master's. But also looking at this question of like, how do we improve the human condition in the developing world, which is really kind of at its core holding this question of like, what is human development? What is human progress? And there it was largely just, how do we make economies grow? Because that was our best tool to bring people out of poverty. We brought 1 billion people out of poverty in East Asia. And there was no real question. There was no fundamental like questioning of that as the instrument. It was, instead of a means to the end, it was the end. No asking these kind of philosophical questions about justice or, that I was really interested in that. So, but I think that chapter of my career really afforded me a robust ability to have a seat at the table where the economists are dominant and kind of critique that point of view. And so that's why the economic reform piece is so much the center of gravity of Denizen, because I have an econ background. But then the third piece of my background that's super relevant is I then came back to Silicon Valley and went to Stanford. And I was a fellow at the design school. And my work there was particularly interested in integrating human-centered design with technology, with improving governments in the developing world. I worked with this amazing political science professor, Jeremy Weinstein. He's now the dean at the Kennedy School, actually. But learning human-centered design like completely transformed me, because I don't know how familiar we are with it, but in my strategy background, it was like very analytical and very linear. And design thinking takes the creative process and applies it to how we do strategy and how we design anything that involves humans. And we can think about evolving it to a nature-based orientation, but it was like fundamentally working in a iterative, adaptable model. So as a strategy consultant, they would give me a project and you would, hide away and do your research, and you'd give them your PowerPoint. You're like, this is the answer. And then they go do that. Yeah. But when you internalize the kind of mindsets of design thinking, it's, well, here's the best answer, and then go run an experiment and learn and iterate. And so, my work is kind of marrying this like macro policy orientation and like the micro strategy from the Google days, but also with this kind of emergent, iterative, adaptive way of working that comes from human-centered design. But, once you get into systems thinking and the complexity of the systems that we're talking about changing, that, like, Danella Meadows, I don't know if you've studied her. She's amazing, right? So that like human-centered design kind of afforded that like really adaptable way of doing strategy around something as complex as what we're kind of after with the Denizen conversation, with your conversation.
How does this label human-centered differentiate, just design thinking in general or design practice?
Design thinking was kind of initially it was a movement away from, I'm designing this cup and I'm just focused on this object, right? To, there's a human that picks up the object and what happens when they put it in their hand or what they do. And so, focusing on the human experience just led to different, what does the human actually need? When you're not object focused, it went to human focus. So originally that was just best practices in industrial design around products.
Right.
And then that got kind of brought into everything, designing, a technology instead of a physical thing, or designing, an experience. And so David Kelly, who founded the D School and founded IDEO, he kind of coined this term design thinking to apply that kind of reorientation of a human-centered process to things beyond, things. That's what design thinking means. And now you might hear critique around like, well, should we be human-centered or should we be nature-centered? Nature-centered, and what does that look like? I mean, that's another piece of it.
Yeah.
And then the last piece of my background that's super relevant is that I'm a mom and I have 3 kids. And, I think we'll get more into it, but, I took a huge step back in my career when my kids were young. I came back to work, like, kind of really wanting to own that part of my story. And so, and also just like lead from a different place than the dominant culture might have us lead. So caring is one of those adjectives in the Denizen. What are the 3 attributes of society? It's just, regenerative, and caring. Thank you, Rosie von Leela, who insisted on caring, but it's so central, right? Because we live in such a transactional economy right now. Like what happens when we center care, it becomes relational. Like, you think about like, we're just cogs in the wheel at the corporations that what happens when we care about the humans in a more fundamental way. And so for me, I think being a mom and coming back into leadership from a very maternal perspective and owning that and being proud of that, and not kind of, you see so many women kind of rising to the ranks, kind of being very masculine. And I really reject that. And so that's just a really core part of how I think about myself as a leader and the work that I do in the world.
Yeah, and you wrote an interesting piece a few years ago, kind of questioning the Sheryl Sandberg narrative. Can you share more about that?
Sure, yeah, of course. That I wrote that, it was the moment, it was right after I stopped breastfeeding my 3rd kid. So it was like each kid kind of got the same experience, which is like the first 18 months, 2 years, I was largely home with them. And I had 3 of them. So that was a lot of years. I mean, I worked, but I was really lucky to work part-time and very flexibly. And my husband had a super ambitious startup. So that just like made sense for all kinds of reasons. And when I stopped breastfeeding Everest, it was like, okay, I'm back. Now I'm going to work, and I'm going to work and I'm going to kind of own it. And so I wrote this blog post called I Didn't Lean In, I Pushed Back. And it was telling my story of prioritizing my family, but also all of the angst I felt about like, WTF, how am I supporting the entrepreneur? That's never who I was supposed to be, right? And it speaks to, such a core part of the work that we're interested in, which is like, how do we deprogram ourselves from the stories about what we value and who we are and where our self-worth comes from. And, Sheryl Sandberg with Lean In, she tells us to like, lean in until like the moment we have our kid, and then have your kid and then come back to work. But then like really give yourself a pat on the back that you make it home for dinner and then get back on your computer until 10 o'clock at night. And it was like, to me, that was capitalism capturing feminism. And with that blog post, which got this amazing reception at the time, it was like it was a declaration of pride around like owning and prioritizing and spending more time with my children during these critical years when they were young. And even now still, and with the belief and hope that like I hadn't completely tanked my career prospects by doing that. And, fortunately it doesn't seem like I have, but at the time it was like, I didn't know. But I wanted to believe that it was possible that, I had all of these years to work after my kids were young, and I do, that I could like come back and still do amazing things in the world, and that I could be a model for other women and other moms to like not lean in, but like own our whole selves and the different roles that we play in the world. And again, embody a world where care matters much more than it does in the cultural context of today.
So Denizen is content production around all these different themes and this inquiry around system change, and you're tugging on a lot of different threads. But part of what I'm finding unique about your work is that you also have this kind of root structure, this foundation of a community, a community of practice.
Yeah.
You're hosting, salons and retreats, and yes, I find that really fascinating. Can you share more about like what else is beneath the surface here?
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, like the podcast is the tip of the iceberg, and then there's a kind of an invitation to come deeper into a community of practice. And I think, the genesis, we haven't spoken to it yet. The genesis of Denizen was in me organizing salons for my friends at home. And then it just unexpectedly became something when we moved it to Clubhouse, and it took off during the pandemic, grew to an audience of 85,000. We said, okay, it's not just me that wants to have this conversation. And so what was unique about it, and even in the earliest days, is it was very much a co-learning community where I was inviting my friends who were all interested in having this inquiry to, okay, you can be our expert to talk about UBI, and you can be our expert to talk about stakeholder capitalism. In fact, Derek Razzo, who I know has been on this podcast, was one of the first moments I knew I was onto something where I had the stakeholder capitalism conversation. Derek came. I didn't know him. He was the first person who was invited that wasn't a friend. And Derek was like, this is awesome. Can I come to the next one? And so we would catch the expert on the conversation, and then they'd join the community.
Right.
And the community kind of grew organically, both from, my original 30 friends who were on Zoom, but then Clubhouse became a magnet for all these other people. So the inquiry very much is itself its own kind of magnet and filter. But the whole thesis around systems change that I'm holding is that we're all complicit with the system by virtue of so many of the things that we do every day.
Right.
The companies that we buy from, the companies that we work for, where we bank, how we speak to each other, the trauma that we haven't done, and we walk around dysregulated. And there's so many ways in which we kind of unwittingly perpetuate, endorse, embody the very systems we're talking about changing. And so my whole thesis around systemic change is like, we all need to take responsibility for embodying and aligning with the alternative. So Denizen has 6 values, and the kind of arguably the most important one is integrity, where we talk about like being in integrity and like actually practicing what we preach. And so that means holistically, like, how do I align with that? Like where I send my kid to school matters. Do I send my kid to a private school that indoctrinates them that their self-worth is about like their resume, like most, or do I send them to a public school? Where do I bank? All of these things. And so Denizen is very much a community of practice that understands that it's not just our professional work in the world, but like holistically how we live our lives. And so we show up to do that work in community. We show up to support each other's work. So, Chelsea wrote a book. I read the book. I support her work through the podcast. But then the listeners can kind of come into this community of practice where we're supporting each other's work. But again, we're supporting ourselves as whole humans. And I'm curating opportunities for us to do the work together. Like I'm doing the work out loud. I just did a bunch of work on myself. And then I'm like, hey guys, this is what I learned. Here's some podcast episodes on that.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to embody and represent that myself, because otherwise I'm kind of just full of it. Right. But it very much is a community of practice where I'm trying to curate for all of us beyond the podcast, like the deeper work that we all will do, but also support each other's work in the world.
And so having spoken with so many different people, but then also having this community of practice, like I'm curious how it's changing you. Like what are some of those learning edges and growth edges you've been through? And I guess a second half of that question is also like, what are you noticing in the community in terms of how's it changing them? What are people going through? Are you seeing common themes, unexpected noticings, whatever that provokes?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, more than anything, Denizen is my own personal intellectual commitment device to do the learning that I never had time to do before I did this.
Right.
When I was working as an independent consultant, and I was helping people do work in this kind of adjacent to capitalism for benefit space, and understanding that, and interested in like, oh, this is how policy can, incentivize more of these better for the world businesses. Still holding this question of like, does that really get us there or not? And that moment of the pandemic afforded the space to embark on that inquiry. And so for me, in some ways still, it's more than anything, my own intellectual pursuit of really understanding at a meaningful level, like how the fuck, can I curse?
Please.
Like how the fuck do we get ourselves out of this mess? Like really, in a real way, not in a Band-Aid way. I was mentioning this before we started, like, not in a Thomas Piketty wealth taxes. We're okay with an economy that yields widening inequality way, but like, no, how do we actually have an economy that like doesn't yield that at a foundational level? But what about justice? Like there's a whole inquiry around justice that I'm under, investigated in, but I know I have serious work to do on myself around my internalized bias. And at some point I'll get to that and I'll do it out loud and I'll invite the community to do it with me. But I think we're all doing the work together and sharing it and holding each other, which has been really beautiful. So people will share like, hey, I just did this thing and it's really amazing and you guys should check it out, So it's like, it's decentralized from just me, and the community is also sharing like what they're learning and what they're going through. And, and this is about like also holding ourselves as whole humans and not just, just kind of breaking that narrative of like my identity is about my resume and my work in the world. But, you come to my retreat and I'll tell you to talk about your love life or your kids or your mom before you talk about your work.
Right.
Because that will follow organically. Or even I just got introduced to someone to be on their podcast. They have a meaningful audience and it was great because he said, let's just record. And I was like, well, let's talk first and get to know each other as humans. And we wound up going instantly into some super deep, super personal things that we're both going through right now. And I'm like, that's the good stuff, because that's like deep human connection.
Yep.
And I feel like we're so much better prepared to go do the work when we center that.
Yeah, it's interesting because like when we started doing this interview series, we didn't have a name of the podcast. We didn't have necessarily like parameters. And we were uniquely like showing up to events and navigating our own personal networks and, just saying, okay, we're going to pull people out and talk to them. And so somewhat random at first based on who was at the event and who we knew and who was willing to talk to someone who, we're starting this thing, but we don't even know what it is. There's no body of work to see. And I started having conversations about well-being, and then there were conversations about psychedelics, and then there were conversations about justice, and then there were conversations. And I went through a bit of an existential moment, straight away of like, okay, like all of these threads are interconnected. And it's alive for people to talk to these different themes because they're real, and then also the practicalities of like, okay, but how do we create a through line to the series? How do I go deep enough in kind of the things I'm really committed to building around and changing, and what is mine to do, and where can I really kind of develop enough depth of expertise. And so like it's tied to a whole bunch of other contexts, but have decided to kind of like really keep whittling into like, we're doing regenerative finance. Right. So I'm curious at this, like, because I really respect what you're speaking to in terms of like system change. It's all connected. And, learning out loud or in public through your journey and sharing it. But I've also like started to go the opposite direction. No, I'm going to really narrow this down and just try to get to the root of capitalism and some of the underlying logics. And like, like curious how you think about it.
Yeah, I don't know. It just, again, there's a lot of weight in the economic reform piece because I think it just spills out into everything. But for me, it just seems, for me, it was very clear that the scope was this kind of broad-based inquiry around systems where consciousness really mattered and culture really mattered and justice really mattered. But I don't talk about climate change. Like, I'm here for Climate Week, but like I'm interested in what are the drivers of climate change? It's our broken economic incentives, and it's our erroneous assumptions about the way our governance systems are going to work to correct for externalities. Like, that's why I'm saying, like, I'm interested in like a stable outcomes that we care about. And so like, I'm kind of still at that root foundational level, again, like I talk about decentralized social media because we need to understand how like the social media infrastructure corrupts, our information ecology or our ability for democracy to function the way we want it to. Like, So I'm only interested in tech as it relates to these institutional questions. But it is immense. And I'm going to be at this, if I'm lucky, this is just what I'm going to do.
Right.
Right. And so there's a whole inquiry. There's a whole inquiry around money that's at my threshold. And that's just in the economics bucket. There's a deep inquiry around governance, and the nation state model is obviously incorrect. How the fuck do we get ourselves out of the nation state model? I don't know, but that's what we need to think through, and again, the questions of justice is woefully underrepresented. So, I follow what I'm kind of interested in and what naturally flows. And I try to kind of have an arc and have clusters that are relevant, but it's slowly stitching together all these pieces. Right. So now I'm going to get into like very interesting cluster around, moving our legal institutions from anthropocentric to legal centric, right? UBI, where does UBI fit in? But then I talk about consensual non-monogamy so that I don't lose my listeners, because not everybody wants to get wonky on policy.
Right.
But like, how does practicing non-monogamy kind of up-level us as humans? Like, how is it an opportunity to practice like rewriting paradigms of scarcity to abundance within us? Like, how does it force us to up-level the way that we relate to be able to resolve conflict in a more sophisticated way. So people really love, and I really love, those very personal podcast episodes that land for everyone.
Yeah.
But the scope is broad. But again, it for me, it makes sense because it kind of stays at that base layer.
Right.
But I think there's room there. All of it is needed.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that you're going like specific enough to be but I try to be specific enough to be actionable too.
Well, yeah, you very much are. I mean, you're a very well studied student of a lot of different topics, and you're going quite deep. Like I don't see very many people going deep into stakeholder capitalism and steward ownership and different forms of governance, and but then also talk about nonviolent communication and consensual non-monogamy is like, okay, you're picking at a lot of different threads, but you're going deep.
Well, I'm going deep enough for it to like us to actually understand it enough to be strategic about it and implement it. Right. Or so it's, my audience is policymakers and practitioners that are on the front lines, and, intellectually curious, everyday lay people who are interested in that level of robustness.
Right.
But, I think given my policy background, given my strategy background, it just naturally makes sense to me to deliver content at a level of robustness that is valuable if you're actually trying to be a strategic actor in the space.
Yeah. Well, I think also that overarching principle of like following your own interests, that was advice we got early on of like, this is a slog. Doing media is like, it's harder than you think, and it takes a lot of energy. And so like, in order to persist, stick with what you're interested in. Otherwise you're going to like be one of the 98% of podcasts that publish a few episodes and then drop off. Whereas you're like, no, hopefully I'm doing this for the rest of my life.
I love this. I love this. Right. And you said you found me in the Clubhouse days.
Yeah. Yeah. I came across you in the Clubhouse days.
Yeah. And so the Clubhouse days, it's like every single conversation. I'm so excited for you to meet this person. They're amazing. I can't wait for you to meet them because I have this like deep adoration and affection for my guests as humans in many cases. Right. And so I think my enthusiasm is part of the value proposition. Right. Is that it's infectious, that I'm that excited to talk about co-ops. Like, why is co-op so exciting? What's so exciting? Because, and so I think that's part of it. But I had lunch with a friend yesterday, and, he's kind of, I had lunch with another friend today, and they're both kind of asking for life advice. It's like, go where the work lights you up. Because I think, too, when you find that, and you find your dharma, which I feel like I did with Denizen, it's like you tap a wellspring and you jump out of bed in the morning. And if you start to, feel like it's a slog, you've kind of come out of, it's just looking at, I'm going to do an episode soon with Diana Chapman on conscious leadership. Yeah. I just recently did a very personal cluster on because I took some time off early this year to do some personal work. And so I was like, hey, it wasn't relevant, guys. Here's what I learned. And I shared that with the audience. But then interestingly, to move from that kind of personal level of work to how does that apply in an organizational setting with conscious leadership? And I was looking through the book a couple of days ago, and there's a page that talked about staying in your zone of genius. Yeah. And looking at what you do in your calendar and saying, okay, what makes my energy go up? What makes my energy go flat and what makes my energy go down,
Right.
and delegating or get rid of or figure out how to kind of stay in that zone of genius where your energy goes up. And so, it's like, I just did an episode on living authentically, and it's all about like, following your innate spiritual compass.
Right.
So I think if you kind of learn to connect to that and navigate your life that way, the energy follows quite organically.
Yeah. She's amazing, by the way. I did a training with her once, and she's really special.
I'm very excited to finally dig into that. I mean, I have the stack of books next to my nightstand, and then I'm like, oh, I finally get to read this because I have to, because I'm having them on the podcast.
Yeah, great. What advice, other than, kind of, I guess, what's implicit there, would you give to aspiring media makers, content producers, people thinking of starting their own podcast?
I mean, I would just, if somebody came to me and saying, hey, I'm thinking about this, it's like, okay, well, why do you want to do this? Right? I mean, I think it's a combination of, what lights you up? Why is this interesting to you? Right? And then why do you think the world needs this? Like, what is your audience? Why does your audience care? Right? So that was the interest. Like, you don't want to find the intersection of those things. Like, for me, I love this stuff. I'm happy to have a commitment device. Like, if it was still 30 people in my living room, I'd still get out of bed to do it. Right? But then it took off to an audience of 85,000 because it's like, I think so many people want to understand these topics, but the way that we organize our time, especially now with our phone addiction, nobody sits down and pays attention to a book anymore. And so to offer in an hour a robust conversation to give people that hefty intellectual knowledge that they're thirsty for, but just can't make the time for, I think that was the need. And so that's what I would inquire if somebody was interested in that. Is like, if you're passionate about it, you'll keep doing it. And if it's striking, and actually, this is the human-centered designer in me, right? If it's actually striking a need, then people will listen.
Yeah. So you're here at New York Climate Week, and you said provocatively that you don't talk about climate change.
No.
So why are you here? And then maybe also let's talk about why we're not talking about climate change.
Yeah. Why am I here? So I started coming to Climate Week a couple of years ago because there was a conference called Unfinished Live. I don't know if you've heard of Unfinished. It's an org doing some stuff in the kind of tech. Frank McCourt started it.
Right.
A huge endowment. And I spoke at that event, and I'm based in the Bay Area. There's a lot of denizens in New York. And so, and again, human-centered design lens on Denizen and all the things that we do.
Right.
Like, oh, cool. I can come to New York. I can go speak at a conference. I get a bunch of free tickets. I invite the Denizen community to join me. We have a shared learning / community building experience. Somebody else does all the heavy lifting on the programming and all of the production. Right. And so I did that. Not last year, but the 2 years before that. And so it's like, oh, then we're in Climate Week and there are a lot of people here. Last year I didn't come. And then this year I got invited to speak again at a different conference called the Transformative Impact Summit. I'm speaking there tomorrow. But there's just a center of gravity of my community and adjacent communities here now. I feel like right now I'm starting to feel also the return on the last 4 years of doing this work, where people are coming to me asking me to co-host events and conversations. It's a natural point for me to be here and coalesce and build the Denizen community, particularly the Denizen community on the East Coast in New York, where I'm not here all the time. So we're going to have a happy hour tonight, and then another social, and then they all meet each other, and then it kind of follows from there. But I think it feels obvious that I would host something next year, or co-host a more robust programming. And again, it's funny, when Denizen first took off, I had this very strong instinct to say what it was and write a set of values. And it still is probably one of my proudest moments in my career, because we did that in community with that initial core community, this beautiful Google Doc with tons and tons of comments. Like, what is this? And what do we value? And the first sentence that came to mind when I threw up that Squarespace website, was like, Denizen is an experiment in provocation and connection. And people don't like the word provocation because it sounds antagonistic, but I kind of love it because it's like and again, this accelerated global awakening component of our mission, which is just I want to kind of provoke you to see what you don't see and open your lens a little bit wider. And so thinking about doing programming at Climate Week, it's like, guys, how much of this, yes, we need to figure out how to deal with the carbon in the atmosphere in the near term, right? But at the life economies thing in the UN yesterday, they're talking about this is a life economy, and they're showing me all of these green businesses in terms of the products that they produce. And it's like, that's not a life economy, right? Like having transforming the energy sector isn't a life economy. Like fundamentally, like what are the incentives of those businesses? How are they capitalized? Is growth imperative? Are we extracting and accumulating wealth? And it's not a life economy. But how many people even really know that or have thought through that? So I'm quite interested in coming to Climate Week next year and having that deeper provocation so that people can kind of see that, like, unless we're actually talking about the drivers, like we're bypassing the root of the problem.
So, I mean, that's a lot of where I've landed as well. Is like I spent a lot of years thinking about farming and forests and conservation and water, and I'm certainly not an expert in any of those topics, but I just felt like the economic drivers were unmistakable. And hence this work. I'm curious what comes up for you. What's the provocation of regenerative finance? This term that we've decided to kind of start to land on. We haven't had this conversation, so I'm just curious, like, what does it mean to you, and how do you experience that relative to all the other terminology that's emerging?
Sure. I mean, I guess my first kind of question that comes up is why regenerative finance versus regenerative economics? That's my first question.
Totally.
I actually just did a salon on regenerative finance with Jasper Van Brakel. I don't know if you know him from RSF Social Finance. So regenerative finance connotes like, how do we transition the financial sector to be regenerative, and what are the principles that we might instill, and how might we think about capital differently, right? Versus regenerative economics, which encompasses like the economy writ large, right? Now, regenerative to me, it's like, how do we have a relationship with all of the factors of production that are regenerative instead of extractive, right? So we often think about regenerative in the context of our relationship with land and nature. But what about regenerative in the context of our relationship with labor? Like, what would it look like to have a regenerative employment experience, for example, right? That leaves you better than you found it. So I think holistically about that term. But yeah, I mean, I guess question for you is, why do you say finance versus sort of economics? I'm curious.
It's mostly because of what's being reflected in the zeitgeist at the moment. And like the feeling and the sense that terminology is going to prevail more in the collective vocabulary. And yet I don't find that there's a strong body of work that's kind of coming from that term into, more of a robust inquiry of the many different facets of it. So it's somewhat, to me, like, I'm somewhat neutral around what language we use between new economy and regenerative economics and regenerative finance, or throw out the word regenerative altogether, but like you have to kind of somewhat hang your hat on a term and a phrase at some level. And because we are specifically interrogating the financial structures that we're trying to say, okay, why is this capital not getting into these hands for the purpose and benefit of the defense of life, on a planet that's currently in crisis? And I think there's some very direct, interventions that are possible to start to move hundreds of millions and billions and tens of billions of dollars if we can, kind of realign things that to me doesn't seem like that big of a jump. And so, like I have whatever, North Star ambitions and aspirations, but I also think like, okay, well, if I can help influence that, then I'll feel pretty good about the impact of the work. And so I want to be in service to those land stewards and those frontline communities who need the capital to, live more harmoniously, within this world. And I think also I am compelled and resonant with your inquiries around governance, because ultimately so much of it just comes back to that, like, I don't think that economics is the end all be all. I do think we have to talk about consciousness, and we have to talk about paradigms, and we have to talk about governance. And
governance is interesting, right? Because it's like, the design space is so broad. one of my favorite comments, my favorite quotes, I quote it all the time, from my co-op conversation was, you've seen one co-op, you've seen one co-op, right? Because you can,
Totally.
the landscape of decisions and the landscape of people who could make those decisions and how those, and voice versus actual decision making. I mean, there's such a huge scope for thinking about governance, right? But it does kind of boil, like corporate governance is where the decisions get made, right? It's like who is empowered to make the decisions and what information do they use? So information could be voiced from others, even though you're not directly empowered, i.e. you have a vote. Your preferences are taken into consideration through some robust process around voice, right? And so there's just, there's an enormous landscape of what governance looks like, but that is where the rubber hits the road. That's where the incentives change. That's in a very meaningful way. That's where like the new next regenerative economy actually takes hold. That's why I have so many episodes talking about geeky corporate governance structures, because like this is actually where it's at, right? But culture is super interesting too, because that's kind of the implicit thing. Policy and governance is more explicit, but culture is this implicit thing that guides what we do. It's like super interesting example. Actually, I just interviewed Rick Doblin at Burning Man, talking about what happened with Maps. I don't know how far you're familiar you are with that story, right? But Maps was, gold standard, steward-owned company. Yep. The Public Benefit Corp was wholly owned by the 501c3 nonprofit. And Rick was not able to fundraise philanthropically to fully retain control of the nonprofit. So he raised capital, but it was like fairly aligned capital with 10-to-1 voting rights. So he, technically from a governance structure, he still had control of, entities that were not incentivized around growth and capital extraction. But what happened is like Maps, the PBC turned it into Lycos. Culturally, like there was a lot of people who came in from pharma. And so like, even though the governance structures were aligned with, not first best steward ownership, but second best retained governance control because of the differential voting rights, like culturally, big pharma culture infiltrated the company. And they started making different sets of decisions. And so that's why culture is so important. Right? It's not just governance structures, it's culture. That's why like conscious leadership is important. That's why like we have to do the work ourselves, or else you don't realize like how much we've been indoctrinated. Right. Because we've been living in this society our whole lives. And so much of it we're just blind to. And that's where Denizen has one of our values is accountability, where it's like we lovingly hold ourselves accountable to those values and point out our blind spots. Right.
And it sounds like you've kind of bringing those themes together in terms of your structure at Denizen. You've gone the opposite direction of Maps, but you've kind of gone from a social enterprise to a nonprofit. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I was, again, I was trying to practice what I preach. I'm going to embody gold standard. I originally incorporated as a public benefit LLC with the intention of being a steward-owned company, except for actually putting a perpetual purpose trust over an LLC, cost $40,000 and then $10,000 to maintain, which makes no sense early stage. And so I incorporated as a public benefit LLC, but the optics of being a for-profit LLC and having a gift model where I'm asking people to even the gift model is like a reciprocity. I give it away for free, you reciprocate, but gift is connoted with philanthropy. So people are like, oh, it's a gift model. And they think like, oh, I'm giving to a cause, not I'm reciprocating for content or community that changed my life. Right. And I just think optically, people resonate more with a nonprofit. So even though it's like what I was trying to embody was too progressive, even for the Denizen community, the most progressive, and so it's just optically makes more sense to be a nonprofit. Unfortunately, that's kind of the way that landed.
Interesting. And how are you supporting the work, fundraising for the work? Like where is that at?
Yeah, I mean, I've been, working for free for far too long. And in many ways, my own personal work of late to get real and vulnerable, because I think that's where it's at, has been in my own self-love. And why has that been okay? I mean, in some ways I feel overcompensated for the work that I do because I love it so much. And it just gives me so much more than it takes out of me. And yet I need to, establish income for myself. I need to contribute to my family's finances. And I let Denizen become extractive for me over time. And so now I'm like, okay, I have a boundary around that now. I'm fundraising. If I don't successfully fundraise by the end of the year, I need to pivot and do something else. Denizen, even in its best case scenario, is not going to pay me what I would like to be paying. So I'm going to have to do things on the side to supplement that. But fundraising for Denizen, because if I don't successfully do that, then I can't justify giving it this much of my time, and I need to start doing something else. But I love it too much, and everybody believes in it too much. So it's more of me just stepping into the discomfort of fundraising.
Yeah.
Like do things that make you feel uncomfortable. That's where you grow. So that's where I'm at to that end. But, I did want to mention, just in terms of accountability and, things that are like unconscious, we just had a really beautiful moment in the community, actually, around a project in the regenerative space that is quite controversial. I won't get into the details of the actual project, but the project is quite controversial, and I'm close friends with the people behind it. And when word of it hit the Denizen chat, there was understandably a lot of skepticism and pushback to what it was, which caused the team behind the project to really say like, oh hey, we've got to have a clearer story in response to this criticism of what we're doing. And that provoked them to think deeper about it. And then I encourage them to have a call. We get some of the people who are part of the community that are in this project. Let's have a call and talk about that, so that we can, like, instead of what we tend to do is behind closed doors be critical of something. Like let's have a conversation so that you can kind of internalize that critique. And we did. And there was a lot of really robust discourse that like really meaningfully evolved my own thinking around, the critiques around that and how I thought about it. And they were kind of like, there was one camp that basically said, integrity, these are our values. This is misaligned. If you're going to be about the regenerative movement, you have to embody the regenerative way of being. Right. And then there's other side that says, this is a cost benefit analysis. Like, sure, there's some costs, but there's really big benefits. And what if the benefits outweigh the costs? Like I kind of, I wound up landing in the former camp, but with a different point of view. And then some people around like how that actually kind of manifested for this particular project. But that was an example of, because I was really holding the position of like, let's not other guys. These are really well-intentioned people coming into the regenerative movement, bringing their passions, their assets, their time, their energy. Like we're all on one team. We might disagree with values. We might disagree with tactics, but broadly speaking, we're all on one team. But this was just a really beautiful moment in the community where like, because we all showed up to that conversation, our collective thinking really evolved.
It's funny. I was at a dinner last night, and we are having a discussion about a controversial project in the regenerative space, which might be the same
probably
one.
is the same one.
And we are also having a bit of a very friendly discussion amongst folks who know and love each other, but maybe had different ways of relating to said project. And so like, what are the qualities of showing up? You said, it was important that everyone showed up to the conversation. Like
what showed up? I just encourage people to like have the conversation, and there was courage that was required to say things that like, and potentially be judged by other people in the community. And so it just like, as the steward, I'm always trying to create a space that feels safe for everybody to do that. And a culture, like what is the culture that I'm creating? I mean, to give a different example, things got really interesting after October 7th, right? Somebody started a Denizen offshoot thread, so we could have conversations about what was happening in the Middle East separate from kind of our main thread, because it was a very sensitive topic. And what was so interesting was watching the tension show up. So, I mentioned our values a little bit. One of our values is curiosity. So partially it's like curiosity brought us here because you have to be curious if you want to sit here and listen to all of this, right? But also it's an incredibly valuable value when it comes to disagreement.
Right.
Like getting curious and what is this really about? And this is like dialectical thinking instead of like polarizing, like really learning from one another and getting curious. But what was happening is people were getting really reactive.
Right.
And it was really valuable to point to those values and remind me. And some people would be like, that's not Denizen enough. That's not, and it's like, we have community agreements.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you're aligned with the community agreements, like anybody who's here belongs here, you know? And it was this really interesting opportunity to bring everybody's awareness into our collective nervous systems and how that was affecting our sense making and leading to more reactivity and heightened sensitivity. And, you know, again, you know, I'm just giving these couple examples of like what it looks like to be a community of practice.
Totally.
And, you know, I have a couple episodes around recent one I'm really proud of called Transforming Relational Conflict that I am extra excited about it because it comes with handouts on actually doing this in your relationship, because our intimate relationships are such important training grounds for being out in the world.
Do you have any of those handouts on you right now?
I will hand them. People have told me they've changed their relationships just listening to them. But that conversation with David, the whole through line is about nervous systems awareness, right? And so it was just, it was a really interesting opportunity to just practice as a community, like nervous system awareness, dialectical thinking, differing points of view, collective sense making. And so, yeah, these are just two opportunities of what it looks and feels like to have community. I mean, I also just, there's such a need for it. I constantly get people who will come in from the website and say, I'm so glad I found you. Now I don't feel so alone.
Right.
I'm sure you get that too.
Yeah. Wow. Really appreciating this rich discussion. I mean, we've covered everything from human-centered design to regenerative economics to communities of practice, and but most importantly, just getting a flavor and a deeper sense of the work at Denizen and your journey into it. Is there anything else you wanted to share, or any topics that I didn't give you a provocation around?
I mean, right now I'm focused on, you know, doubling down on the things that we do well, which is the media and the community component of it. Because it's been me, a one-woman show, so fundraising to compensate me and hire someone. But there's a second half of the mission, which is around galvanizing collective action. Because like Denizen wants to be a part of a movement. I mean, it is a part of a movement. We didn't speak to one piece of it, which I think is relevant, which is I formalized partnerships with 12 organizations, including Buckminster Fuller Institute, Purpose, Capital Institute, Context Institute, Zebras Unite, organizations at the forefront of the space where I am modeling a cooperative economy with my work with them. I meet with them once a quarter and I talk about what's up with you, how can I support you, what can I do, and I plug, you know, regenerative economics when the course comes through. I put that in the newsletter because again, it's it's like an engagement ladder from edutainment on the podcast into doing the work and more of a community of practice once you're into the newsletter. But I feel like when I look at like what Denizen's potential is, you know, it has a potential to be like a bigger movement, a bigger node in this broad movement that we're all a part of. And the galvanized collective action part gets me excited because I feel like, you know, we're under levered in my background in strategy. You know, we're utilizing it very heavily in my ability to very quickly come up to speed, right? But I'm not really being used yet in my competences in, you know, system strategic thinking about intervention points. And, you know, Denizen is this unbelievable meta team of humans that work at the forefront of media and new economics and consciousness and psychedelics. And when you think about interventions that can bring those creatives together with those activists, together with those funders, it's like hugely exciting what that might look like. So there's an interesting opportunity as Denizen is like a think do tank, but also to the extent that there's trust in me around opportunities for collective action. I mean, that was something that always became kind of apparent to me that was possible. And we're also under levered in my background in design thinking in terms of doing design sprints. So I'm really excited about opportunities to like, you know, curate a team of people from the community to do design sprints to support orgs with their work, where you know, again, you have that heterogeneity of background. So just to kind of give a flavor for what I think is possible, I'm very much currently just focused on like, let's not get distracted from just nailing the thing that we're already doing well and doing it appropriately. But I do, again, the whole thesis is like change from within is Denizen's tagline. That hasn't come up yet, right? So the provocation, the awakening is about the holistic responsibility for systems change. And I think once you come into the ecosystem, like doing the work holistically, but also doing the work strategically across the actors. And so I'm excited about, a movement around systems change that we're all a part of, because as crazy as it sounds, like, it has to happen. It's daunting to even talk about it happening. And the way that I think it happens is that we all take responsibility for it and all see it that way. At least that's my thesis.
Right.
And sometimes it just feels, it's like I walk into Target with my kids and I'm just like, oh, why do I bother? I just want to give up, but it's like, well, I don't know what else I would do,
I have that same experience when I walk into Target.
Yeah. It is daunting. I'm just, and I'm sure there's more pockets out there, but I'm surprised that I don't find more people. I just think that most people are so marginal and they don't even realize it. It's just, there's so much effort that goes into this whole marginal social enterprise impact investing space, which, I think if you hold that question of how do we get from here to there and how does culture change happen, right? Like, this is an evolutionary process through the state that we're in potentially. Yep. And like, if we took the time to stop and think and we realize that this is marginal, this is not actually addressing the problem, would we do it differently?
Right.
And so that's what, like, I just keep kind of honing in at that particular angle of it, that piece of the puzzle of like staying at 30,000 feet, trying to stitch it all together and, trying to help people like wake up from, they just don't realize that they're being myopic. They don't realize that they're being marginal because like, we just don't have time. The way we organize our time and now the way that our attention is just like sharded by technology, like just, I don't find, and I would love to see more of it. I would love to know that there's more of it that I'm not aware of, but I don't find very many people who are thinking this robustly and comprehensively about this stuff.
Yeah, well, the sirens blaring in the background is like an ominous telling, backdrop to what you're speaking to. But I do trust that there are more folks out there, and hopefully some of them will be listening right now, and will go check out your work at becomingdenizen.com.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for your time. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun to have this discussion with you, Jenny.
Yeah, I always love it when I talk to somebody who's been at it on a comprehensive inquiry alongside mine, because I'm able to go in deep on so many different things that I'm rarely able to do with one person. So thank you for the work that you do. I really appreciate it.
And for more great discussions, just check out maearth.com, and we will continue publishing out our conversations from here at New York Climate Week 2024. See you on the next one.